We may never again see a headline that so perfectly encapsulates the U.S. policy toward Israel's total war on Gaza. U.S. sends Israel 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs for Gaza war. After sending massive bombs artillery shells, U.S. also urges Israel to limit civilian casualties. What a sick joke this all is at this point. Leaking to the US press how concerned you are about civilian deaths, while expediting shipments of the very weapons that Israel has used to slaughter innocents on a scale that we have not seen from a developed country in modern history. Every day, practically every hour, we learn of some new fresh horror. Here is one of the very latest. A journalist allowed into a hospital that had been forcibly evacuated by the IDF makes the most grisly of discoveries. 4 premature babies in a state of unimaginable decay, their bodies eaten by worms and mauled by stray dogs after doctors were forced to evacuate that facility. Now, the nurse responsible for their care described the wrenching decision to leave them behind in an interview with the Washington Post. He said, quote, "I felt like I was leaving my own children behind." That nurse took the baby he considered to be the strongest and most able to survive without oxygen with him when they were all forced to flee. That baby was then taken to Al-Shifa Hospital, which was raided mere days later. Now, I want you to understand, these atrocities and the many others we've witnessed in Israel's assault on Gaza, they are not normal. They are not the unavoidable cost of war. These babies and the other untold thousands of innocents who have died are not collateral damage. They are intentional targets. And a new expose by 972 magazine lays out the exact strategy that lies behind can only be called a campaign of all-out terror. In this war, civilians and civilian infrastructure, things like hospitals, are targeted directly with the explicit goal of shocking the population. And in a dystopian flourish, AI is being used to accelerate the carnage. Here is that piece from 972, a mass assassination factory inside Israel's calculated bombing of Gaza. Now, when you look at today's videos of children buried under rubble, entire residential neighborhoods destroyed, lifeless bodies of babies in the arms of grief-stricken parents, keep these words in mind from one of 972's sources. Quote, "Nothing happens by accident. When a 3-year-old girl is killed in a home in Gaza, it's because someone in the army decided it was not a big deal for her to be killed." Israel's periodic wars on Gaza have never been the beacon of humanitarian warfighting that Israel's presented to the world, but some of the minimal guardrails that did prevent mass civilian death have been lifted in this current assault. This is evident in Israel's overwhelming focus on 2 types of targets: private residences and so-called power targets, which are things like hospitals, apartment buildings, infrastructure, and other key centers of civil society. During the first 5 days of this war, half of the targets that were bombed were, quote-unquote, power targets. And the goal of this bombing campaign was not to eradicate Hamas, as Israel has claimed. Instead, the goal was to, quote, "create a shock that, among other things, will reverberate powerfully and lead civilians to put pressure on Hamas," as one source put it to 972. Another source explained that the buildings only needed the most remote connection to Hamas or Islamic Jihad to be targeted for complete destruction. Quote, "If they would tell the whole world that the Islamic Jihad offices on the 10th floor are not important as a target, but that its existence is a justification to bring down the entire high-rise with the aim of pressuring civilian families who live in it in order to put pressure on terrorist organizations, this would itself be seen as terrorism, so they do not say it." In other words, terror is the explicit goal here. It's the very same goal, by the way, as Hamas on October 7th, except in this instance, it's terror by a supposedly civilized nation-state armed to the teeth by the world superpower and given diplomatic cover with 0 red lines. The attacks on these power targets have also stood out for their unprecedented scale of civilian death. According to 972, in prior wars, civilians were more consistently warned ahead of bombings. The IDF would leaflet, they would send messages, they would use a quote-unquote roof knock to warn the building was about to be attacked. They would use drones then to even monitor civilian departures to make sure people were leaving. Not so in this war, where many buildings have been bombed with no warning and with hundreds of civilians still inside. Another major focus of Israel's bombing campaign has been the private residences of low-level Hamas operatives. As one source who was unhappy with this practice said, quote, "In the majority of cases, military activity is not conducted from these targeted homes. I remember thinking that it was like if Palestinian militants would bomb all the private residences of our families when Israeli soldiers go back to sleep at home on the weekend." The blanket assault on these private homes, where many families were still located, has been aided by a new AI tool, which uses algorithms to produce targets. According to The Guardian, this has dramatically accelerated the IDF's target generating capability from 50 per year to 100 per day. Quote, Hamas members who don't really mean anything live in homes across Gaza, so they mark the home and bomb the house and kill everyone there. Taken together, these reports thoroughly debunk the already preposterous idea that Israel was surgically targeting Hamas. No. IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari was closer to the truth when he said this, quote, the emphasis is on damage, not on accuracy. These are the tactics that the U.S. government is meekly protesting as the bombing campaign now moves to the south, where most of Gaza's 2.2 million residents have been forced to flee. Already, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed in that renewed assault. If this bombing of 6 residential high-rises in Khan Yunis is any indication, the focus on destroying power targets to terrorize the entire population remains firmly in place. And the truth is, the Israeli government can't be so stupid as to think that any of this is actually in the long-term security interests of Israel. To think that massacring children by the thousands is going to lead the Palestinian population to turn on Hamas, it will not lead the population to turn on Hamas. It will certainly lead some of the population to turn into Hamas or to embrace other groups advocating violent armed resistance. No, the real goal is to put on a show for the Jewish Israeli public, 58% of whom do not believe the IDF has been brutal enough, and only 1.8% of whom believe that they have gone too far. The real goal is a last-ditch attempt by Bibi to stay in power by showing just what a monster he can be to satisfy a monstrous public appetite for death and destruction. As one source explained to 972, there's a feeling that senior officials in the army are aware of their failure on October 7th, and they are busy with the question of how to provide the Israeli public with an image of victory that will salvage their reputation. Apparently, that sought-after image of victory is that of decomposing babies left to suffocate and starve in a power target also known as a hospital. Real tough, guys.
Hey guys, if you want to see what I had to say to Krystal's monologue, not just this one, all of them going back to the very beginning, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com.